Ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome, everybody. This is David Hollenberg. I'm sitting at home here. On my lap is Hind, the cat, and I am going to record this initial PowerPoint. Um, this is going to be a series of fairly brief presentations that is meant to be a preliminary toward the study of modern standard Arabic. What you've been learning up to now is Egyptian vernacular Arabic, Egyptian dialect. Um, to know Arabic is essentially to know one of the dialects fairly well, and to know modern, what's known as Fusha, that is modern standard Arabic, the Arabic that's used in formal discourse and written discourse throughout the Arab world. And so our idea is that for this first year, we're focusing on Egyptian Arabic, but in 103, we're going to start setting you up for for a focus on Standard Arabic, which will be the main focus next year, as you also continue on with Egyptian Arabic. So I wanted to give you a little bit of context, both historical and I guess sociological, on the nature of the Arabic language, the history of the Arabic language, and what we mean by dialect versus standard Arabic, and um, other related aspects of the language. So, historically, this is one way of dividing up Arabic, very crude, but you have Proto-Arabic, the Nabatean, you had these early forms before Arabic had all of its distinctive features. Um, and then in the very early period of the 7th century, before the Islamic conquests, you had two types of Arabic, essentially, a northern and southern type, the pre-Islamic period. Now, in the third period, you had the birth of really al-Arabiya, classical Arabic, what we call classical Arabic. This is the Arabic of the Quran and the early Islamic tradition, and really was the model for Arabic forevermore. And you also had the birth of dialects, which were basically a mixture of these happened after the Islamic conquests, when you had Arabic being mixed with the languages that were in the different sites prior to Arabic. So for Egyptian Arabic, for example, prior to Arabic as the primary language of use, you had Coptic, which was spoken in Egypt. And so if you look at it, if you analyze Egyptian Arabic, you'll see there are kind of some Coptic elements underlying it, and that hybridity generated its own distinctive dialect, which is different from one finds, for example, in Iraq or in North Africa, and whereby you could find similar phenomena there. So that's the classical Arabic and Arabic dialects. Classical Arabic would remain somewhat, it does change over time, but because there's such adherence to the Arabic of the Quran as a model for the Arabic grammarians and lexicographers, classical Arabic changes much less than other languages are known to. Middle Arabic, I won't spend a lot of time talking about, but let's just say there was a time from about the 11th century to the mid 19th century, which is described as Middle Arabic by the linguists. And what this really is you start to have some creep of dialectical Arabic into classical Arabic when people were writing, and also some attempts to hypercorrect and insert classical Arabic features, but not follow the rules of classical Arabic very well. So that's Middle Arabic. And then Modern Standard Arabic. Modern Standard Arabic is a modern formulation of Arabic based on the classical Arabic, and came as a result of people in the 19th century deciding that this Middle Arabic was kind of a mess, and they wanted to classicize and standardize the language again. So the nice thing for us is that modern standard Arabic, which is what we're focusing on, is actually closer to classical Arabic than to Middle Arabic. So it's kind of going back to the roots. And what I think is kind of exciting is that if you learn modern standard Arabic, al-Fusha, you're able to read classical Arabic texts. So you really have access to materials going back, millennia, which is unusual. Now, one thing that we should mention and makes Arabic, among the things that make Arabic challenging is that, on any given day, a native speaker is actually using different registers of Arabic, depending on the context of the discourse, so that, it's kind of a continuum between, say, really very much vernacular, like what parents would talk, how they would speak to their little kids, or when in a very kind of environment with just close friends, talking about everyday topics like how you doing, how you feeling now. This is just the pure vernacular, like everyday speech that is quite different from standard Arabic. You have, so linguists have studied and they've noticed that, if you have someone who's educated, that is to say, who can, is comfortable reading and writing, they will code switch and use what you might call an educated vernacular. So it's not pure vernacular, but if you're at if you're meeting somebody and you're talking about a news story and you're talking about, something that calls for more elevated language, it's not quite pure vernacular, it's not quite MSA, it's something in between. And there are these different levels, people kind of go up and down the ladder between pure vernacular and MSA when they're speaking. MSA, Modern Standard Arabic, or Fusha, is the language that one would apply when writing something formal. And when I say formal, anything from a letter to a professor, to a newspaper story, a literary book, anything like that. And the vocabulary for MSA is massive, whereas the vocabulary for any particular dialect is more limited. Such that, and this was interesting, I was just in Egypt, and I was telling an Egyptian young man that our students were learning Egyptian Arabic for first year, and he said, "Oh, that's interesting, but quite honestly, there are many things that I couldn't possibly say in Egyptian Arabic that you have to say in Fusha. Like if I was describing anything with any depth, Egyptian Arabic would not have the vocabulary." So he was just kind of like taking the longue durée, but like in your futures. Anyway, so I just thought that was an interesting comment because I had not heard that before. That's MSA. And then, even in today, you would use classical Arabic, for example, when you're praying, when you're reciting the Quran. If you were to be in a pious mode and want to study classical Islamic sources, then you'd be reading classical Arabic. If you cited a hadith, a report by or about the Prophet Muhammad, that would be in classical Arabic. So on any given day, a native speaker is going to use all these different, we would call them registers, these different forms of the language. So what MSA are you going to be learning this term? What types of things? And to be clear, we're not going super heavy on the MSA this term. This is I consider these little videos preliminary. It's kind of some stuff that you really should be familiar with, and some stuff that you really need to know. So and I'm going to be clear, and Hanan and I are both going to be clear, at the difference. So first of all, key concepts in syntax, morphology, you might not know, you probably don't know what I mean by syntax morphology, but I will explain that are understood as essential for the study of a language like Arabic. So, in other words, we're not even at this point asking you to apply syntax and morphology necessarily in the beginning anyway. We just want you to at least understand, what do we mean by syntax and why is it important? What do we mean by morphology? Why is it important? And what are some key concepts and terms in Arabic syntax and in Arabic morphology? So this is sort of setting you up, as it were, for actually learning the content, which you'll be doing next year. Number two, this is one of the important things. We're going to ask you to master the most important morphological patterns and paradigms. And when I say master, This really means it has to be kind of imprinted on the back of your mind, such that you could, I mean, what I tell, students, it has to be solid enough that if I were to wake you up at 4 in the morning and go, hey, give me the fourth form mustar, you could just like spit it out. It has to be that solid. Now, some of you will be able to get it that solid this term, and some of you it won't happen until next year. But the quicker you do this, the easier it's going to be for you to learn the language. So it's just really important. So that's two. Third, learn the grammar for the two basic types of sentences in Arabic: the verbal sentence and the equational sentence. So the terms and what they mean and all that. Terms for the different parts of the sentences, and we'll be talking about case and all that fun stuff. And learn the Arabic terminology for all the preceding. So there's terms that go with this that allow us to communicate in class about it, that'll allow you to follow discussions about it as Arab grammarians talk about it, and it's just part of learning the language. Okay, so first of all, by morphology, what do I mean? I'm talking about morphology. A morpheme is a form, a shape. So morphology is the study of, or the study of forms. And here, so here we're really talking on the level of the word, and nothing else. So if you have a word like run, or ran, or running, you can see these are different morphological forms of the same basic, of a common word, which having to do with to run. So unlike in English, in Arabic, morphology is incredibly systematic and systematized. It was systematized by non-Arabs in the very early period, and then systematized again in the modern period as part of the Renaissance of the Arabic movement. So it's the one thing about Arabic that is kind of, that makes it easier on non-native speakers to learn it. And so I actually think that, I mean, the two biggest sort of, hurdles for learning Arabic is vocabulary. The vocabulary of Arabic is massive and largely unrelated to English, and so so that's probably the most important thing, and just getting in the habit of studying vocabulary and getting these words down. You have to do it. And the second most important thing is learning these patterns of these morphological patterns. And so by morphology, so again, to recap, when we talk about morphology, we're talking about words and their shape and what goes into them and the patterns that are being applied to them. So that's morphology. Yeah, whereas by syntax, what we really mean by that is how the words are relating to each other in a sentence. So syntax really, at least in our world, is largely applying to sentences, whereas morphology is applying to individual words. So if you have a sentence like she ate the cake, you've got she, and you've got cake, and you've got ate. And how those words are relating to each other and what roles they're taking on in the sentence, that is what syntax revolves around. So let's start with a point of morphology, and then we'll close the day with this. And this is something that maybe you can work on Thursday, and Hanan will direct you with this. But most Arabic words, and actually, in one of the defining characteristics of the whole language group that Arabic is in, which is Arabic is a Semitic language, and all Semitic languages, that is to say Hebrew, Aramaic, Akkadian, Ugaritic, all these languages have a system of words whereby they are based on triliteral roots. That is to say, most words in Arabic have 3 root letters, which are then manipulated in different ways to form words. And so when you're learning a word, it can be useful to learn what is the root of that word. what is the root, and what are the extra letters that are, being added to manipulate it in some way as part of what may be a pattern. It's usually a pattern in some pattern or another. So at this stage, what's really important to know is what are the kinds of things that tend to be added. It's kind of like what gets mixed in to the roots. And the quick list would be long vowels, first of all, somewhere usually in the middle or usually in the middle of the word. The tamarbuta, that a at the end, is always a addition. And certain other letters, most importantly probably is the mim, the letter mim at the beginning of the word. I guess I'll also add a ta in the beginning of the word. All of those are things that are added to the triliteral root to make words. So just to look at this list of words and go through them, if you look at chamsa, the word for 5, I think you'll be able to identify what are the root letters. The root letters would be cha, mim, sin, and the tamarbuta has been added. Shahar, pretty straightforward. The three letters there, those are the root letters. Shahara, yom. Here you might think, oh, wow is a long vowel, but no, in this case it is part of the root because it can also be, those are also treated as consonants depending on the context. So this is ya, wow, mim. Shanal. So again, that aleph has been added. So the root would be shin, mim, lem. Waset. Again, there's a wow, but it's part of the root here. So it's wow, sin, tha. Semek, fish. Sin, mim, kaf. Those are all root letters. Flus. So here the wow has been added. So the root is fa, lam, sin, with that u in the middle is not part of the root. Thalath. Again, that aleph has been added, so the root would be tha, lam, tha. Akhir, the ya has been added, so the root would be hamza, kha, ra. Asir, the ya has been added, so the root is ayin, sad, ra. Madrasa, so what's going on here? So just to remind you, the mim is one of the letters that gets added. So take off the mim, and the tamarbuta also gets added. So what are you left with? Darasa, madrasa. So the mim and the tamarbuta go, and the root is dal, ra, sin. Kanisa, again, the ya and the tamarbuta can be wiped out. So it's kaf, nun, sin. And look at this last one, daqiqa. What do you think that is? It's sort of, yeah. So here, even though the qaf is, it's a doubled qaf, each of those counts as part of the root. So the root of that is dal, qaf, qaf, and it's being manipulated to daqiqa. Excuse me. And at this stage, it's hard to explain. Explaining the importance of identifying the root, it's almost, as you learn more words, you'll start to get the feel for why it's important, because there are patterns for how they're manipulated, and let's just leave it at that for now. So the take-home point from this whole slideshow is, I'd like you to understand when Hanan or I talk about morphology or talk about syntax, what we're talking about. I'd like you to be able to know, know that Arabic words have 3 root letters and only 3 most of the time, and that identify and start to get a feel for identifying those 3 letters from more complex words that have more letters in them. And I'd like you to sort of at least have some idea of what we're studying here, that we're studying Egyptian Arabic and now we're studying Standard Arabic, and what those starting to get a feel for how those are used and what they mean. So thank you for listening, and there's an online quiz to demonstrate that you've heard this video, and that Hanan will have you fill out online.